A great man once said, "We don't make mistakes, just happy little accidents." It's a good quote to take through life, even if it might not apply to something like putting a red top in with your whitewashing. And hey, Bob Ross was full of pearls of wisdom like this, but what the hell does he know about video games? Dude was painting trees all the time, he didn't know! With a number of mistakes committed by an industry that has 1,000,000,001 opportunities to make huge errors, you'd have to have optimism made of rainbows and sunshine to see these problems as any kind of positive. Despite the stacked odds, sometimes the gaming industry has enough accidental creativity to stumble its way to success, and make a game that was never meant to be created in that way. I guess you'll take what you can get, right? It's maybe not something you'd see often in the current age of massive development teams laser focused on making one kind of game, but you might be surprised how some of your favourite games came from working on another project. That to me sounds like a pretty happy accident, since while it might have been nice to see what kind of game was the original intention of the devs, accidentally making a really good game is hardly something I'm going to complain too hard about. I've been in quarantine so long that I'll take whatever game you can throw at me. I don't care where it came from. Originally, I wanted to make a video about games that spawned from other games, but then I got caught up in reboots and spin-offs, and eventually I decided that it'd be better to focus on games that took an unusual route through development to being made, and you never know, it could provide inspiration to any struggling developers out there. After all, this video started off as one thing, and eventually became the thing you're watching right now. It's everywhere you look. I love a good old-fashioned pointless tech demo. The recent reveal of Unreal Engine 5 reminded me how much I love seeing technology push itself to absurd extremes that are barely comprehensible by the average onlooker, but I couldn't help but think how few games are likely to come close to getting the most out of this fancy tech. After all, this is just a tech demo that is missing a lot of crucial features that stop it from being a fully fledged video game, and it's hard, at least at this stage, to imagine this being expanded out into something tangible. It's the difference between a beautiful drawing and some animation done in the same style. You're only seeing a snapshot as opposed to a realised product. I say that, but Nintendo gained a lot of publicity from their showcase of Mario 128 at Space World 2000, where having a bunch of Marios on the screen at the same time as a showcase of the GameCube's processing power, and as a potential sequel to Super Mario 64 was a big fucking deal. And I can fully understand that. You can get excited about your 16 billion triangles, but I'd rather have 127 extra Marios. That's a lot of dead Goombas. I remember reading a lot of gaming magazines in the early 2000s, and there was a decent amount of hype behind Mario 128 for this weird project potentially being a useful tool for future GameCube games, and I suppose 1 or 2 Mario games in the future as well, but I couldn't really participate because I was young enough to not know what a tech demo was, so I was just wondering what kind of Mario game would require 128 Marios? One where you grow them from the ground, I guess. What you're soon going to realise is that mistake has a broad definition. Maybe it wasn't Nintendo's intention to use something with Mario's face on it as the building blocks to go ahead with Pikmin, but considering how there were rumblings of a large part of Mario 128 being used to create a new Mario game, I can happily assume that Nintendo decided that repurposing its parts was in their best interest. And who's to argue with that when it helps spawn Metroid Prime and Pikmin, as well as the spherical environments of Super Mario Galaxy, with Pikmin in particular being the most interesting because of how clear a through line there is. Like, you'd never need much convincing that a demo featuring several dozen small characters would later transform into a game where you control up to 100 small aliens at once and command them to do your bidding. Although, part of me wishes the aesthetic of Mario 128 was retained, because the idea of commanding 100 or more tiny Marios to take down some horrendous thing sounds very appealing to me. Don't rule it out in the future. Mario's played basketball and gone snowboarding before. He can't control himself. You never quite know where inspiration will strike from or what people will find enjoyable. That's part of the joy and maybe frustration in creating anything really. Your audience won't necessarily enjoy the same things as you and may well find enjoyment in unusual places. On the face of it, Project Gotham Racing is an unremarkable racing game that's barely worth talking about at the best of times, even if it does sound like some cheap Mario Kart clone with Batman characters instead. Weirdly, it's the second best selling game of all time for the original Xbox behind Halo, so clearly it was doing something right, but I want to talk about the sequel, since we're here to talk about accidental video games, and developers Bizarre Creations accidentally made an in-game arcade cabinet the best part about Project Gotham Racing 2. It's a close race though. In a way, the people who made this game were wasted on racing games. Bizarre Creations eventually went the way of Sierra and Radical Entertainment by being closed down by Activision, but that wasn't before they accidentally gave the world Geometry Wars and a host of sequels. Not that this game was initially the focus, since Bizarre only included their arcade machine because they had a lot of fun playing around with this program during Project Gotham Racing 2's development. A program that was only originally designed as a way of testing the Xbox controller. You can see some of that with the way the original Geometry Wars is designed, but it's also so flashy and colourful that I can fully understand how players became addicted to it. You could be racing a car around a track right now, but why not stay in your garage where you can chase high scores so lofty that your ship turns into a reminder that you should subscribe if you're enjoying this video and hit the bell if you want notifications of every new upload. It's like Asteroids on LSD, and so it's not surprising that its standalone release once held the record for the most downloads on Xbox Live. Maybe more creators need to include their little time wasters in with the project they were working on. I drew this while writing this video. It's supposed to be a duck. I like to think that most developers know when they're about to create one of the most important games in history. I suppose some of that can be filled in for them based on timing and what releasing a certain game on a certain console at a certain time will do, but that's important because you need resources funneled into the dev team to give them a fighting chance, especially when they're also tackling new technology at the very same time. It's strange to think that Final Fantasy VII started life on the SNES and in just 2 dimensions. Especially when you think that we're currently enjoying a long-awaited remake that will stay relevant for a good number of years until all its episodes have come out. Things could have easily been very different if Chrono Trigger hadn't interrupted the early stages of development. Plans were still in their infancy when things had to be put on pause to work on Chrono Trigger, and by the time they resumed, Square Enix had a better idea of their options for a 3-dimensional game. A bit of a risk though, because it would require a complete graphical upheaval and most of the existing work wouldn't be all that helpful, but it's not like Square was short of ideas for the 7th Final Fantasy game. Tetsuya Takahashi and his wife Kaori Tanaka proposed a new concept for Final Fantasy VII, born out of frustration at the narrative stagnation present in recent games. Which I kind of understand, but it's not like the previous 6 games had dumbed down stories in them. I remember Kefka killing a lot of people. So, just how far are we going then? Final Fantasy VII tried very hard to distance itself from previous games by expanding on the medieval steampunk of the 6th game and adding a whole lot more sci-fi elements to go with all the other changes to aspects like the combat and environmental design. The aim was for a more mature, realistic take on the genre, which I feel it achieved very nicely, but the story goes that the Final Fantasy that Takahashi and his wife pitched was even darker. Probably just a little too dark for a series reimagining though, and Tanaka and her husband's vision was morphed into what we now know to be Xenogears, with all its religious subtext and psychological deconstruction, which, come to think of it, might have been a little too much for a Final Fantasy game. Certainly I can see a lot of areas where Xenogears could easily be knocked into the general shape of a more typical Square RPG, but I think you'd lose a lot of what made this game so difficult to make and indeed localize. That in itself is a good enough reason for 2 separate games to be made, because you gotta know that Square Enix would have had a lot more problems localizing such a massive controversial game than they already did with a smaller release. Plus this way, Final Fantasy gets a marquee entry into its franchise, and Xenogears gets the ball rolling for Xenosaga and Xenoblade to come afterwards. That's a lot of games made from one correct decision. Creating a successful franchise of games has to suck. Yeah, the money and accolades and fan adoration are all great and probably help soften the blow, but with incredible success comes equally incredible pressure to make the most out of this good fortune. Just think about the expectations behind something like Breath of the Wild 2 off the back of the first game's massive sales and review scores. Suddenly it's so much easier to upset fans and make something extremely below par since the bar has been raised so high. This is partly why I think Resident Evil 4 underwent such a vicious design process. Since 1999, Resi 4 went through at least 4 completely different versions, with the design team given free rein to reinvent the series in an exciting new direction. Ideas were tossed to and fro with scenarios ranging from the decidedly too formulaic tussle with zombies, to wackier ones like Leon being infected with a virus that gave his left hand all sorts of powers, and having to fight some kind of hook man. It took a while for Capcom to land on the Resi 4 that became such a huge influence for so many games, but the first version had Hideki Kamiya at the helm, and he had very ambitious plans. He wanted to call the main character Dante, what a weirdo. The Hideki Kamiya we know from Now Times is the Twitter-blocking maniac working with Platinum Games to give us stylish action games every couple of years. But he started working out on Resident Evil games for Capcom, and hey, they have their quirky moments from time to time, but they're a lot less fluid than your typical Kamiya game. Clearly he was just saving up his crazy for the right game. Although, maybe that game isn't Devil May Cry. We might now know this franchise for being full of flashy combat and big personalities, but in 2001, with the release of Devil May Cry 1, the similarities to Resident Evil were a little more noticeable. Maybe not so much of all the extravagant lore, since Resident Evil got into some weird shit, but at no point did we ever get demons and gods and angels. But you watch an average cutscene from DMC and you can feel the Resi campiness bleed through for all to see. That's before you realise that the fixed camera angles must have been carried over from some kind of early Resi 4 prototype, and suddenly everything clicks into place in a really satisfying way. It's kind of amazing how 2 very different games made by the same company can feel so similar tonally, despite one being survival horror and the other having way too much action for that. Just think, we could have had a Resident Evil 4 that completely abandoned the franchise's roots and traded out scary horror for balls-to-the-wall action. Then Resi 6 wouldn't feel so out of place. Maybe in another universe. Big franchises can sometimes have the humblest of beginnings. Generally, the origins become more wholesome the older the franchise, since you get more stories of channeling childhood memories and less about cranking out games to suit a current trend, but it always surprises me just how accidental some of them can be. Maybe it was a creative decision made on a whim that affected the entire trajectory of a franchise, or maybe it was an errant line of code that completely altered the behaviour of some of the AI-controlled characters in the game. Grand Theft Auto wasn't always this self-assured money-printing juggernaut of a franchise, and had to rely a bit more on original concepts to turn heads instead of scenes that only exist to stir up some controversy. Not that the original GTA had much trouble with publicity, because it's often cited as the first game that deliberately used controversy for some free marketing, even getting banned in Brazil for excessive violence. But maybe that was the accident. GTA is a bit of a miracle really, because its original devs, DMA Design, struggled to get the game out of development hell for the longest time. They were struggling for so long that their style of overhead 2D racing looked a bit dated compared to the recent rise of 3D racing games. And so friction within the dev team, along with the complex nature of Grand Theft Auto with all its open world exploration, led to a difficult atmosphere which made it tricky to code the game together. The glitch that everyone knows about now is that the police were hyper aggressive for no real reason, which is a clear and obvious mistake, but one that gave this game a breath of fresh air and a bit of character, and something that sets it apart as a game that you've just got to try to see how insane the cops are. I reckon that if Grand Theft Auto was coded normally, the series wouldn't have lasted long enough to release 7 major games and numerous expansions, shipping over 300 million copies in total. Imagine if in GTA 5 the police kept their distance from you and politely asked you to stop committing all the crimes. It's just not quite the same, is it? This is RabbidLuigi, and it is wild to think that Grand Theft Auto nearly started and finished its life as a racing game, although it kind of makes sense since there weren't that many games in the 90s that let you commit crimes, but that's just a wonderful thing with the police glitch that allowed this to happen in a more flamboyant way. If anything, it's an endorsement for fun over realism, because the police acting normally would be realistic and important for that, but it's not as fun as watching them behave like psychopaths. It does pay to remember what video games are for. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.